Maybe you grew up hearing it at the dinner table. Maybe it was your mum, or your nan, or your uncle after a couple of beers at Christmas. Somewhere along the line, someone in your family said the words, "mother of all budgets," and the room changed. Not everyone agreed on what it meant. For some people, it was the moment the government finally got serious about fixing the country. For others, it was the moment the safety net got ripped out from under the people who needed it most. But almost everyone over a certain age in this country remembers 1991. They remember the freezing works shutting down, the queues outside work and income, the families who suddenly couldn't pay their rent because the government had tripled it overnight, the word euthanasia on the front page of the paper, mixing the finance minister's first name with the word for ending a life. And if you're younger, you've probably felt it without knowing where it came from. You've looked at benefit levels and wondered why they're so low. You've seen food banks in a country that's supposed to be one of the best places on earth to live and thought, when did that start? You've voted under MMP and never been told that the reason New Zealand changed its entire electoral system was because of what happened in this one budget. Nobody ever sat you down and told you the full story. Not the version from one side or the other. The actual story, start to finish, with everything in it. That changes now. By the end of this video, you'll understand the mother of all budgets, the way it actually happened. Not as a political slogan, not as a talking point, as the single most consequential economic decision in modern New Zealand history, and the one that still shapes how this country works, argues, and votes today. Everything about the mother of all budgets comes from two questions. What was the government actually trying to fix in 1991? And why did the fix end up reshaping New Zealand for the next 30 years? Those two questions sound like they should have the same answer. They don't. And the gap between them is where this story lives. Before you can understand what Ruth Richardson did in 1991, you need to see the country she inherited, because the mother of all budgets didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of a decade of chaos. Go back to 1984. New Zealand was a different place. The economy was one of the most regulated in the developed world. The government controlled wages, prices, interest rates, the exchange rate, imports, exports, and most of the major industries. Robert Muldoon had run the country like a command economy for nearly a decade, and it was falling apart. When Labour won the election in '84, the new finance minister, Roger Douglas, launched a program of radical deregulation that became known as Rogernomics. In the space of a few years, the government floated the dollar, removed import controls, deregulated the financial sector, corporatized state departments, cut the top tax rate from 66% to 33%, and introduced GST. It was the most dramatic economic transformation any developed country had attempted in peacetime. And it was done at extraordinary speed, with almost no public consultation. The results were brutal. State-owned enterprises shed thousands of jobs. The Electricity Corporation cut 3,000. The Coal Corporation cut 4,000. Forestry cut 5,000. New Zealand Post cut 8,000. Towns that had depended on a single employer woke up one morning to find the employer was gone. Then in October '87, the share market crashed. Globally, it was bad. In New Zealand, it was catastrophic. The NZX lost 60% of its value from its peak. Other countries recovered within a year or two. New Zealand's market was still devastated 4 years later, worth $14 billion down from $45.5 billion before the crash. The Reserve Bank refused to loosen monetary policy, keeping interest rates high to fight inflation, and that decision turned a bad crash into a deep, prolonged recession. By 1990, per capita GDP had been falling or stagnating for 4 straight years. Unemployment was climbing toward 11%, and the government's books were bleeding. That's the country National inherited when they won the 1990 election. And what they found when they opened the books was worse than anyone had told them. Before you can understand the crisis or the cuts, You need to understand the idea that sits underneath both of them. That idea is austerity, and it's simpler than it sounds. Austerity is what happens when a government decides that the way to fix its finances is to spend less. Not earn more, spend less. The logic is straightforward. If you're running a deficit, which means you're spending more than you're bringing in, you have three choices. You can raise taxes to bring in more money. You can borrow more, which pushes the problem into the future. Or you can cut spending to close the gap from the other side. Austerity is option 3. Think of it like a household that's been putting groceries on a credit card for years. At some point, the card is maxed out and the interest is eating you alive. You can get a second job to earn more. You can open another credit card and keep going. Or you can stop buying things. Austerity is stopping buying things. The problem is that in a household, you get to choose which things you stop buying. Maybe you cancel the streaming services and keep feeding the kids. But when a government practices austerity, it's choosing which people get less. And that's where it stops being economics and starts being politics. Because austerity is never neutral. Somebody always carries the weight. The question is who? That's the foundation. Now the two tools are simple. Here's what the crisis actually looked like. When National opened the government's books in late 1990, they discovered that the outgoing finance minister David Kagel's projection of a modest surplus was wrong. Not a little wrong, completely wrong. Instead of a small surplus, the country was facing a fiscal deficit of $3.7 billion for the 91 to 92 year if nothing changed. That was 4.8% of GDP. The net public debt was sitting at 52% of GDP. To put that in perspective, that's like discovering you owe more than half of everything the country earns in a year. And it was getting worse. The state-owned Bank of New Zealand, one of the country's biggest banks, needed a multi-million-dollar recapitalization just to keep operating. The government had to bail it out. Meanwhile, the economy was shrinking. Unemployment had climbed past 10% and was heading for 11.1% by March 92, the highest on record. Factories were closing. Freezing works that had been the backbone of small-town New Zealand were shutting their doors. 76,000 manufacturing jobs vanished between 87 and 92. Whole communities that had existed around a single industry were hollowing out. The recession that had started after the 87 crash was now entering its 4th year, with no sign of stopping. GDP per capita fell or stagnated every year from 86-87 right through to 93-94. That's 7 to 8 years. The longest recession in New Zealand's post-war history. At its worst point, economic activity was 9% below where it should have been. And inflation was still running too high for the Reserve Bank's target. The Reserve Bank was actually raising interest rates during the recession to try to bring inflation down, which was like putting the brakes on a car that was already sliding backwards down a hill. This matters because whatever you think about what came next, you need to understand that the crisis was real. The deficit was real. The debt was real. The Bank of New Zealand nearly collapsed. The economy was in genuine trouble. Something had to change. The argument was never about whether to act. It was about how and at whose expense. Now here's what Ruth Richardson actually did. And this is where the story gets hard, because what she did was enormous in scale and it hit fast. Richardson was from the free market wing of the National Party. She believed in small government, individual responsibility, and market forces. She'd been watching Roger Douglas's reforms from opposition and believed they hadn't gone far enough. Where Douglas had deregulated industry and finance, Richardson wanted to deregulate the labor market and reform social welfare. These were areas the Labour government had refused to touch because they would hurt their own voters. Richardson had no such hesitation. In July 1991, she delivered what she proudly called the mother of all budgets. The name was borrowed from Saddam Hussein, who'd recently described an upcoming military confrontation as the mother of all battles. Richardson meant it as a joke. It wasn't funny for long. The budget cut welfare benefits across the board. The unemployment benefit was reduced by $14 a week. The sickness benefit was cut by $27 a week. The family benefit was slashed by $25 to $27, and universal family benefit payments were abolished entirely. Think about that for a moment. If you were a single person on the sickness benefit, you lost $27 a week overnight. That's over $1,400 a year, gone, from a payment that was already barely enough to live on. But that was only the beginning. Richardson introduced user pays requirements in hospitals and schools. Services that had been free for decades now cost money. She introduced market rents for state houses, which in some cases tripled the rent that low-income families were paying. She increased the superannuation surcharge from 20% to 25%, breaking a direct election promise National had made to remove it entirely. And alongside the budget, the government passed the Employment Contracts Act, which swept away the system of national awards that had governed employment conditions for decades. Compulsory unionism was abolished. Individual employment contracts replaced collective agreements. The explicit purpose, as Richardson herself acknowledged, was to drive wages down quickly. Working closely with Social Welfare Minister Jenny Shipley, Richardson dismantled large sections of the welfare state that had been built in the 1930s by the first Labour government. This wasn't trimming around the edges. This was structural demolition, and it was done during a recession when the people being cut were already at their most vulnerable. The effects showed up immediately. Poverty researchers later measured what happened to the incomes of welfare-dependent households. They fell from 72% of the average national income to 58% in just 3 years. The number of New Zealanders living in extreme poverty, defined as less than 40% of the median income, doubled from 4% in 1990 to 8% 2 years later. Child poverty jumped from 15% in 1990 to 29% by 94. Food banks, which had been virtually unknown in New Zealand before 1991, became a permanent feature of the landscape. Families unable to afford heating or rent doubled up under one roof. Mold and damp spread through overcrowded houses. Diseases like rheumatic fever, which had been eliminated in other developed nations, came back. Hospitalizations of children for medical conditions rose from 50 per thousand to 70 per thousand, starting in 92, the year after the budget. And here's the part most people never see. There are 2 ways to tell the story of the mother of all budgets, and both of them are true. That's what makes it so difficult and so important. From the top floor, the one where you measure deficits and credit ratings and inflation targets, the story is one of rescue. Richardson's cuts, combined with the Reserve Bank's tight monetary policy, brought inflation down to the 0 to 2% target band by 1992. The fiscal deficit was closed. By 1994, New Zealand posted its first budget surplus in a generation. The sovereign credit rating was saved from a double downgrade. The Fiscal Responsibility Act, passed in 94, created a framework for transparent public finances that other countries studied and admired. New Zealand became the only country in the world to integrate a modern balance sheet with its budget. The economy recovered and began growing without inflation for the first time in living memory. From this floor, the story is about a courageous government that made hard choices and saved the country from a fiscal cliff. From the ground floor, the one where you measure what families eat and where they sleep and whether their children are healthy, the story is devastation. The budget doubled extreme poverty overnight. It created food banks in a country that had never needed them. It sent children to hospital with diseases that didn't need to exist. It tripled the rents of people who were already struggling. It cut the incomes of the most vulnerable citizens during the worst recession in a generation. Here's the part that makes this a revelation, and not just a disagreement. The economy recovered within 3 years. The benefits stayed frozen for 30. That's not a typo. The benefit levels set by Richardson in 1991 were not meaningfully raised until 2021, when Finance Minister Grant Robertson explicitly referenced the mother of all budgets and said his government would address what he called the most inequitable of the changes made 30 years ago. For 3 decades, across Labour and national governments alike, the cuts held, the economy healed, the people on the ground floor did not. And that's the thing most people never see. The austerity and the recovery aren't 2 separate stories. They're 2 floors of the same building. The fiscal consolidation that saved New Zealand's credit rating is the same set of decisions that created a generation of child poverty. The Employment Contracts Act that helped drive employment growth in the mid-90s is the same law that crushed wages at the bottom. You can't celebrate the recovery without acknowledging the damage, and you can't condemn the damage without acknowledging the crisis that made some form of action necessary. Both floors are real, both floors matter, and once you see the building whole, you can't unsee it. Now, here's what most people get wrong about the mother of all budgets. The first mistake is thinking it was an isolated event, a single bad budget by a single radical finance minister. It wasn't. It was the second act of a reform program that started under Labour in '84. Roger Douglas deregulated industry and finance. Ruth Richardson deregulated labour and welfare. Rogernomics and Ruthanasia are 2 chapters of the same book, written by 2 different parties, who agreed on more than either of them would like to admit. The second mistake is thinking the cuts were the only possible response to the deficit. They weren't. Raising taxes was an option. Slower, more gradual cuts were an option. Targeting the cuts differently was an option. The crisis was real, but the specific distribution of pain was a choice. Richardson chose to balance the books primarily by cutting spending on the most vulnerable, rather than by raising revenue from those most able to pay. That was a political and ideological decision, not an economic inevitability. The third mistake is thinking New Zealand has moved on. It hasn't. The benefit levels set in '91 shaped poverty outcomes for 30 years. Food banks still operate across the country. The vote for MMP in '93, which completely changed New Zealand's political system, happened because voters were so angry about successive governments breaking their promises and implementing radical reforms without mandate that they chose to make it structurally harder for any single party to hold unchecked power. Every time you vote in an MMP election, you're living in the aftermath of the mother of all budgets. Let me show you exactly how this knowledge is useful right now. Next time you hear a debate about benefit levels on the news, you'll know where the current levels came from. They weren't set based on what people need to live. They were set in a fiscal emergency in '91 and barely adjusted for 3 decades. Next time someone asks why New Zealand has food banks when it's supposed to be a wealthy country, you'll know the answer. Food banks didn't exist here before '91. They were created by a specific set of policy choices, and they persisted because those choices were never fully reversed. Next time you vote under MMP, you'll understand why you're voting under that system. New Zealanders chose MMP in '93 because they were horrified by what First Past the Post had allowed. 2 successive governments, Labour and then National, had won elections on moderate platforms and then implemented radical reforms that voters never asked for. MMP was the public's way of saying, never again. And next time an older Kiwi talks about not trusting politicians or governments, you'll understand the scar tissue. For a generation of New Zealanders, the lesson of the late '80s and early '90s was that it doesn't matter who you vote for, they'll do what they want once they're in. That cynicism didn't come from nowhere. It came from lived experience. Here's what you now know. You know that New Zealand entered the early '90s in a genuine fiscal crisis, with a deficit of billions, a collapsing bank, and an economy that had been shrinking for years. That's the first thing. The crisis was real. You know that the mother of all budgets responded to that crisis by cutting welfare, introducing user pays, deregulating the labor market, and tripling state house rents, and that these cuts fell hardest on the people least able to bear them. That's the second thing. The distribution of pain was a choice. And you know that the economic recovery and the social damage were the same event seen from different floors of the same building. The books balanced, the poverty stayed, and New Zealand is still living in that building today. That's the third thing, and it's the one worth remembering. If you grew up hearing about the mother of all budgets at the dinner table, now you know what everyone was actually arguing about. Not whether something needed to change. Something did. But who was asked to pay for it, and for how long the bill lasted. The economy recovered in 3 years. The most vulnerable Kiwis carried the cost for 30. That's not a political opinion. That's what happened. And understanding it is the first step to understanding how New Zealand works today. This is general education, not personalized financial advice. If you need advice for your situation, talk to a licensed financial advisor.